Hello everyone, my name is Louise Glanville and I'm the CEO of Victoria Legal Aid. Great to have you joining us again today for our sessions, 5 Questions for 5 Women, our Women in Leadership series. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of all the very different lands on which we're meeting. For me today, I'm on Wathaurong lands, which is down near our Geelong office, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and note that their lands have been never ceded. And I look forward to the outcomes both of the Royal Commission here in Victoria and the Uluru Statement of the hard work that is happening at the federal level. I'm delighted to be joined today by Vivienne Nguyen. Viv, welcome.
Hello, Louise, and good afternoon, everyone. I too also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm joining you from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to the elders past and present. Thank you, Louise, for having me on. Thanks
so much, Vivienne. And Vivienne likes to go by Viv, so that makes it a bit simpler for this. It'll certainly save us a wee bit of time, but delighted that you could join us today. And I think Viv will be known to many of you who are listening. She's a very good LinkedIn user, so you'll be able to see her on that, but she has a very impressive career, which I'd like to share with you before we start our 5 questions for Viv. Firstly, for over 25 years, she has worked as a business executive and a community leader in corporate, community and government settings. She is, of course, currently the chairperson of the Victorian Multicultural Commission. Viv has held roles at Auschoice Financial Services, AMP Asset Management and ANZ Banking Group, where she led the global organisation's diversity strategy. Viv became a member of the Order of Australia for significant service to the multicultural community of Victoria, which is a fantastic achievement, and was part of Victoria's first anti-racism task force to help inform and drive the state's anti-racism strategy, amongst many other interdepartmental committees and ministerial advisory task forces and councils. And I note particularly the relatively new federal Minister, Attorney General Mark Dreyfus's interest in anti-racism as well, and his references to the Australian Human Rights Commission. Along with her corporate career, Viv's community activities span many different cultures to provide input into public policy on asylum seekers, civic engagement, participation and human rights. So I know it's always slightly embarrassing. I think it's a bit of a women's thing, actually, that we all don't like hearing our achievements. But Viv, tremendously important for us to have you with us here today. And I do note your stellar career in so many ways. So I'd like to really start by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself. Question 1, your current role, what motivates you, and perhaps some of your personal priorities.
Yeah. Thank you, Louise. Yes, it is true. I always cringe every time I hear something about myself. It must be a women's thing.
Yes.
And it doesn't matter how long you read it or how long somebody's read it. It just feels a bit awkward.
Yes.
Here we are. About myself. Okay, so I came to Australia in 1983. December 1983. So many of you would know the end of 1975 when the Vietnam War was supposedly ended, and we were from the losing side, the side of South Vietnam. And my dad was at the time working for the American high-ranking officials as an interpreter. So some few years after 75, lots and lots of people were put into what they called the re-education camp, and that was one of those. When he left about 4 years later, he said to us, that we need to leave because we wouldn't have a future here. What do you mean a future? I was, at that time in year 7, and in many, communist governments, you see young students with a red scarf. I was one of those, very actively involved, and I didn't really want to leave because I didn't know what it meant. But everybody said you needed to, and so off I went, as any 11-year-old girl or daughter would do in my tradition. When parents say you got to do something, you got to do something without questions asked.
Yeah.
So I did. We were on a boat that was 11.5 meters long and 2.5 meters wide. And what I learned later, an engine that was 1.5 horsepower. I don't really know how powerful that was, but it carried 57 people. And I also learned later from my cousin, who was the organizer or the people smuggler in our current day term, because Dad did pay some money to him to build the boat. And so there were 57 people, 40 of us were women and children, and I was a tomboy, Louise. When I left home, we went to a kind of a hidden house. We stayed there for 4 nights, and then we got moved onto this boat, that 11.5 meter long boat. And as soon as I got in, I still remember in my mind, as soon as I got in, they shifted me from the small boat to the big boat. It was at night time. I was just like, moving, pushing everyone away, and got myself a spot where I actually lie down. So I lie down and I got myself a spot. It was until we got out to sea, and the boys around me, everyone around me was getting nauseous. So I sat up to give some of the space. I was always, it's trying to look after myself, if you like. Then we went to the refugee camp in Malaysia called the Pulau Bidong, and I stayed there for a year, and I came to Australia via the Qantas plane with my 2 older brothers and 2 older sisters and a sister-in-law. So that was my life to Australia. And in December, as a Christian,
were you very you talked about the feelings a bit there, what you were feeling, you'd have to do what your parents asked you to do, so of course you did that, but was it it sounds anxious to me. It sounds sort of anxious, furtive, all of those things. Is that how you experienced it?
Yeah, well, there was a lot of things. I was 11, so I knew some things, and I didn't know some things. Right? And I was starting year 7. I certainly didn't want to leave, because we got heard stories about people being eaten up by sharks, or if you didn't make it and get caught, you would get your head shaved and put in jail. So everybody knows you've tried and you didn't make it. So it wasn't something I was willing to have a go, because I didn't want to die. I didn't want to get eaten up by a shark. It was just too scary. But I think it was just the way that everybody said you had to. So I went, and I saw Dad being away for 4 years in jail, and it wasn't a very pleasant time, if you like. The time in the camp and the first couple of years in Australia was most memorable, but also most difficult. Because when I came, I started year 7 in high school. We had English as a second language teachers who asked us to retell or to share our story, to kind of let it out of the system, if you like. Deliberately or not, I don't know, Louise, but to me, it was quite a healing process. Or, you had time to grieve, and you let it out of your system, and you didn't have to carry so much of it with you.
Yes.
So yeah, I am eternally grateful for my English as a second language teachers who taught me a lot about the Australian life in the early days, because not having your parents, you relied on a lot of those adults, and the older brother and sister had to work, so they didn't really have a lot of time for us either.
Yes, yeah. And so then you arrived in Australia. You clearly had that experience of giving your lived experience in the school setting, and then what led you to where you are now? What were some of the steps to get there?
Yeah, I've always wanted to be a social work, but my cousin said to me as we were doing year 11 and 12, he said, you'll never make good money doing that.
No.
I said, oh, okay.
I'm a social worker too, of course, and a lawyer, but I am a social worker.
And at that time I said, because I wanted to work alongside people and to do things with people. And so, and Dad constantly wrote to us, and, you must do this, you must do that. And one of the things that Dad really wanted me to do was to study business. So I did. I traveled down the business path, but along the way, I always did some community work. Right from the time I was able to up until now.
Why was that? Why was that? What was inside you that led you to must do some community work as well? What was that about?
Yeah, for me, it's a couple of things, Louise. For me, the opportunity and the commitment to participation is really important, because we got taught there wasn't a lot we could do because of our parents' background with the former regime. We weren't allowed to do a lot, and we felt we were constantly watched. So we had to be very careful about that. So when I got here, and you felt, it's kind of the freedom land. You felt that you could do it. So I wanted to. I just wanted to take part. I just wanted to know. I just want to look around, but always with a very strong sense of that financial independence. I would hate to think that I had to rely on somebody financially. To me, that was one important component of what gives me the option to look after myself, as well as the ability to be able to assist others. But yeah, that very strong sense of participating in this country was something that really drives it. And I also wanted to understand how I could do that, what would limit me or what would enable me to do that. And then the same apply when you get older and you start working or volunteering in communities, and you get to see why it's so important for community service, civic engagement, and things of that nature.
That's really helpful, but you're generous in sharing those thoughts that you've had. Tell us a bit about your leadership journey, because clearly you hold a very important position in Victoria, in the one that you currently hold. And how has that emerged for you? How have you got to that point? What drove you to go in that direction? Yeah, some reflections there.
I think a key turning point for me was when I had Fraser in 2011, and a couple of years later, he was diagnosed with autism.
Right.
And I have to say, it was probably one of the most difficult times, for me as a person of faith. I often, especially when we were told by the pediatrician, I often looked up and said, God, I've done a lot of good things, what have you done? What have you done to me, and things of that nature. Then I started to look into what was very new for the NDIS at the time, and I asked questions and all of that, and I found the whole thing very difficult to navigate and to work out how to support my little Fraser. Thank goodness Fraser is considered relatively reasonably functioning young boy. He's 11 now, but that was what got me thinking about systems and structure, because for me, as an individual, yes, racism and all the things that I experienced, but I was financially independent. I was on my way to acquiring an education, and I volunteered, so I kind of knew my way around a little bit. But I kept thinking about Fraser, how people like Fraser would be able to navigate life, if the system was just so complicated and complex. And so that's what got me thinking about where would I spend my time? Am I spending time in my corporate career and thinking about making money, if you like, or where would I be better spending my time? And that was also when I turned 40, Louise.
Right.
And all of that was happening at that time. And I quit my job. I quit my board. I quit the whole lot and just spent a year contemplating life. And Fraser gave us so much joy. So what was the initial complaint became a total blessing. And that's how I found myself in the role of this role now, thinking about where you would make change, and that's you want to make systems change to support others who might not be able to be as able to navigate the system.
I love the way you took time out in that.
Yes.
And clearly there was big events in your life that had occasioned that, but that you took time out to think about what you wanted your life to be like, and what contribution did you wish to make, and to make sense of probably the things that had happened to you over your life, in the way that you've described it. That's really, really interesting. And just perhaps, what have you learned about yourself as a woman on this leadership journey? We touched very briefly at the beginning about, I'm a bit like you. I don't like people talking about what I've achieved very much. I find that quite hard too, but I've got a bit used to it. But it is, what are the other things you would perhaps identify that a characteristic of yourself as a leader who's a woman as well?
I think one of the biggest challenges for a woman, and particularly a woman of color, is that cultural challenge. It is very difficult to work out what's best or what's better of my culture to use and to apply in certain contexts and settings, and what's to let go. So when I was in the corporate world, my culture and my identity did not at all come into that environment. So I was just Viv Nguyen, and I was just focusing on my career. I wouldn't talk about my family, certainly nothing about what I would do, have done or attended on the weekend or anything like that, because all of that would be seen as career limiting, because you're not focusing on your work, you're focusing on something else that's not really relevant to your job. It took a long time, and it took to a point that Fraser and my husband also got cancer as well, all at the same time. And so it took those sorts of events or for me at least in my lifetime, to actually stuff this. I don't really care if I'm going, because I got to, I planned myself, well, not I, but my husband and I, we said I wouldn't have our first child until I get to a certain senior level at the bank or at the corporate world.
So very deliberative about
very
that.
deliberate, yes. And we wouldn't have our child number 2 if I did until I got to this certain level. I was very kind of focused on that. And then when these things happen, you sort of look at, oh, well, stuff everything. You just kind of quit the lot and then think about what you want to do next. The cultural challenge, and I find that more now, Louise, is that the generational challenges between the first generation and the second generation is very different. First generation expect a woman to be all of the things that they've been grounded or learned about. And I can't do that. And I've always felt very out there with my own Vietnamese culture. Too outspoken, too out there, too this, too that. And that's certainly, that sense is coming back a lot more now because of this role that I play. I play this role that I hold. They expect me to do this, but also when I'm in the community, I'm still, timid, shy, obedient, all of it, which is very hard to navigate between the two.
Yeah, that is so interesting, and I imagine that would be particularly challenging, because you can, I think, separate, your sort of your internal feelings and your external appearance and how you are at home and how you are at work, but generally, you've got to have some consistency, don't you? Or else it becomes quite bifurcating and not very helpful, I think, to our growth generally. So
and not authentic.
Not authentic, completely. Which takes us beautifully to question number 4, and that is, what do you think makes an effective leader, Viv, in your experience, or just what you've read, or what do you think makes an effective leader?
I think I came into this leadership position at a time of the crisis, and so for me, you've got to be real.
You mean COVID when you say the crisis?
Yes, that's right. Yes. So I took this role in September 2019. And then, we had all of that in early 2020. I think for an effective leader, you've got to be real, you've got to be authentic, and you've got to be genuine. And you can't be the one that finds all of the solutions. And especially for this role,
collaborative leadership,
you've got to have that, and you've got to find ways to bring people in. And especially in this role, we, from a cultural diversity perspective, we have 300 ancestries. We speak 290 languages. We practice more than 130 faiths. We need to be able to find ways to do that, and you cannot do that if you are the decision maker, you are the traffic cop, you are everything, and so I think that's what I think is really important, that you don't have the solutions, and yes, you can make mistakes and all of that. I think what we need to do more is to make sure that people don't feel so penalized when they make an innocent mistake.
Yes,
and things like that, and yeah, I won't know everything, and I might use a word that's out of context and all of that, but if I did that again and again, then that's not acceptable. But in that context, you've got to collaborate, you've got to find ways to engage other people, you've got to find ways to think, to consider their views and perspectives, and it needs to be more systemic, it needs to be more structured, which is what I'm trying to do in this role, Louise. More proper and systemic ways to ensure that people do have a voice and can have a voice that's actually meaningful, and not as tokenistic, if you like.
Yeah, that's really reflective, really helpful, I think. And you know, I have found in my career that really where I've learned the most is when things have been really hard or when I've made an error. That's the reality, you know, and it's about, I think, looking at that and accepting we all make errors, and it's what you take from that, and it's what you do the next time round. I think that is really meaningful. And just the last question for you, Viv, is to if there was one thing. This is a hard question. This is the one most of the women I've spoken to have found the most difficult. But if there was one thing that you were interested in changing, either in the local setting or in the state or a national setting or even an international setting, what would that be? What was the difference you would wish to see in the way we are currently?
I think there's, when you gave me the questions, that was the most difficult question to spend time on thinking about, Louise. But I think if we can create an environment of safety, physical and or emotional and or psychological, because if we feel safe, then we would be far more confident in participating, in contributing, in having a say or putting forward our opinion, and wanting to take part in something and not feeling excluded. That to me is important, and that can be reflected in many ways, whether you have representation, you get, you know, great workplace cultural environment, safe workforce diversity, and a whole range of things that we could see how that, if you like, manifests itself. But I think that sense of safety, physical and non-physical, is really important.
What a fantastic way to end. Viv Nguyen, thank you so very much for your time today. It's been great to hear your insights, and I thank everybody for your participation and look forward to joining you for our 5th session next time round on 5 questions for 5 women in leadership. Thank you so much. See you soon.